With our time change, hopefully the 11 o'clock crowd's a little more awake than the 8:30 was. No? Yeah, I'm dragging a little bit this morning myself. Let's dive in to the mystery that we're before. There they are at the well in the midday heat. It's the Holy Land, it's hot. And she is doing what she always does, is get water. Her life is difficult. Her life of cohabitating with a man who is not her husband is not right, and she knows it. Maybe she feels trapped. Maybe she feels discouragement or despair about making the same bad choice again and again. Cannot seem to extricate herself from it. Jesus is there, and he sees her. Remember that it was scandalous for Jesus to strike up a conversation with her, and she's rather surprised at his first request. He is a man, and Jewish men did not engage in conversation with unknown women. And he's also a Jew and a rabbi, and she was a Samaritan, and never were the two supposed to meet. Nonetheless, he breaks the silence. Give me to drink. He's physically thirsty because he was tired from his journey. He's also thirsting for something more, for her faith, for her salvation, the salvation of her people, the salvation of the whole world. And right now, he thirsts for her. You know, the Gospels for the next 3 Sundays of Lent are all from the Gospel of St. John, and they're a series of deep, personal, and transformative encounters with Jesus Christ. Today is the woman at the well. Next week will be the man born blind, and then it will be Lazarus, all converging on the Holy Triduum, where we encounter again for ourselves how deeply and personally Jesus thirsts for us. And he wants to heal us, to liberate us, to transform us by his love. And Jesus breaks the silence and initiates the longest conversation recorded in the Gospels. Give me to drink. Jesus' thirst brings him right into the life of this Samaritan woman. And what really strikes me about that initial part is that, notice the divine Lord, the divine Son, the Lord of the universe, allows himself to be thirsty, and he asks for help. That humility that draws her heart to him. His thirst is the occasion for their encounter. Give me to drink. Jesus asks for a drink, and then he promises a drink to her. And what does she do in this conversation? She does something very remarkable. She stays in it. She stays in the conversation with Jesus. She has a desire for the Messiah. And although her knowledge of the Messiah was incomplete because she was a Samaritan, she was still waiting for the Messiah to come, was still looking for him, even in the complexity and the ambiguity of her life and her life choices. It must have been very uncomfortable for her to be in that conversation. He was a stranger and yet knew the most intimate details of her life. And she didn't shirk away of the knowledge that he had of her. She's willing to be vulnerable to him. He brings up the truth of her life, and not in a shameful way, right? Jesus doesn't shame anyone into conversion, but in a truthful way, a loving way. What's keeping her from God? And she denies nothing, makes no excuses, and it's through this deep personal knowing and allowing Jesus into the mess of her life that she begins to recognize him. First, as a prophet, because who else could have this kind of knowledge of her? And then, ultimately, as the Messiah himself. And you notice how Jesus accompanies her, gently leading her into a deep conversion of her life. And in this encounter, we can see something very deep going on, because this is always happening in the Gospel of John. There's this, what's going on at the surface level, but whatever's going on, there's deep mysteries being revealed. And this is the case as well. So where are they? They're at Jacob's well. They're at a well. And you know, because I know you know the Old Testament really well, what happens at wells? This is where the great men of the Old Testament found their bride. Isaac, Genesis chapter 24. Jacob himself, Genesis 29. Moses, Exodus 2. So in this encounter with the Samaritan woman, Jesus is revealing himself that he is looking for his bride, the church. And she becomes a type, though imperfect, of the church, who is to become the bride of Christ, who gets healed and liberated and transformed by her divine bridegroom, and then unites herself with him and becomes the instrument of his salvation to the world. And as she is walking her own life, as she is walking through this transformative encounter with Jesus, she begins to resemble who the church is. A bride who will share ultimately in his life and mission. And you notice what happens too is that the woman, she leaves her water jar there at the well, and she goes off into proclaim Christ to the townsfolk. So consumed is she with him that she's no longer bound by the mundane. She starts to live at a whole new level of life. Right? To live according not to the well where we will drink and be thirsty again, but the well that he gives us. A well a water that comes from within to well up to eternal life. And although she's not fully conscious about all of these mysteries, thinking of her own intuition, she takes on this thirst that Jesus has for her, that she has that thirst of the faith of her fellow Samaritans. Her vulnerability moves into faith in him and into a deep conversion, and then becomes a missionary for him. And what happens to those Samaritans when she goes and starts proclaiming about what she knows about Jesus? They start believing. And this encounter sets the pattern for our life with Jesus, I think. And notice what Jesus does in bringing her into this conversion, from where she was to where she is now. And he doesn't say, okay, now go sit in the corner. You know, you've messed up your life. I'm not really that interested in you. No. She becomes his ambassador to the people of that town. Right? And this is what the Lord does with us. Right? Perhaps we've started out misunderstanding a little bit about who he is, about what life is all about. And when we begin to follow him, we don't always know what we're getting into with him, do we? Even though we can be genuine and sincere about our questions and about our desire to follow him. I imagine those who are married will attest that they didn't know all the ramifications of that decision at that time. Right? It's similar with priests and religious in our life choices. But wherever we are in our vocation, it could be in our spiritual life, our moral life, what is the Lord doing? He comes to us, patient and gentle, meets us where we're at, but then begins to pull us into a deeper life with him. Because he knows the life where he met us is a life that was making us miserable. It's a life of being alienated to him. And what does St. Paul tell us today? While we were sinners, Christ died for us. That he wants us so desperately. And perhaps he's brought up to us our darkest selves, our greatest weaknesses, our most intimate secrets. Can we imitate the Samaritan woman in not denying that or making excuses? We don't have to feel ashamed about it, but rather allow him into the mess. Allow him into that part of our hearts. And if we do, then we can enter that intimate, personal, and transformative encounter with him to be healed and set free. And in fact, I think he does this deliberately. He will lead us to meet him in the deep down darkness of our hearts. And I think there comes a point in life, maybe there's more than one point, either in our vocation, whether our spiritual life or our moral life, where we come face to face with our inability to follow him, come face to face with our inability to will and to even do what is good. And that disturbing realization dawns in the heart that says, I can't do it. And there we have a choice. There we have a choice. We can step back, or we can stay in the conversation. How easy it is to step back from that pain and that realization. But how necessary it is to stay in the conversation. It's the only way things will change. And the Samaritan woman gives us that example. I think Jesus necessarily brings the soul to that point because he wants to draw greater and greater trust out of us. That we cannot enter into a life of union with him without absolute vulnerability and trust. And so our love needs to be purified. And that intimacy and union that he desires to have with you and me as members of his bride, the church, can only occur with this death to our ungodly self-reliance and our selfishness. And so the key is that vulnerability. Stay in the conversation. And if we do that, this is what he's thirsting for. He's thirsting for that vulnerability, that trust, and the faith in him. And we quench his thirst by that. And if we do that, as he promised in the Gospel of St. John in chapter 7, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water, welling up to eternal life. That he'll strike the dry, lifeless rock of our heart and unleash his living water. And so let's drink deeply of the water that he offers us. And let him unleash this water within us for a thirsty world. You know, in every Mass, in every worthy reception of Holy Communion, more grace than we could ever conceive, the grace to trust and to be vulnerable with him. His own body and blood is placed into our mouths and swallowed down to unite us body and soul with him, the divine bridegroom. And so he's asking for that now. My bride, give me to drink. Yes, Lord, I will quench thy thirst.